Welcome to the Classical Architecture Workshop. My name is Professor Brandon Rowe, and today's lecture we'll be looking at how to draw the block Doric order. Before we begin, there's a couple things that you should know. We'll be using William Ware's The American Vignola as our guideline. The Doric order is one of 5 classical orders. It is one of the lower orders, and what makes it unique is you'll notice that specifically in the Doric order, it has above the column what are called triglyphs. These triglyphs in many ways go back to primitive wood construction. They're supposed to be derived from, say, the ends of beams and rafters in a primitive wooden construction with larger beams. And under these triglyphs, there's other elements that we'll get into when we specifically draw the entablature and other things along those lines. But one thing is for sure, as we're thinking about the Doric order, specifically the Roman Doric order, when we create this block order, we have a proportion of the column which is 8 diameters tall, and the entablature is 2 diameters. And we'll get into that in just a little bit more detail. Here's a sneak preview at the drawing that we are going to create with this Doric block order. And a block order is essentially a simplified version. It doesn't have all of the many various profiles and things along those lines. We'll get into those when we dive into the actual column capital as well as the column base. For this tutorial, you're going to want to have a couple of supplies ready and available on hand. You're going to want a sketchbook or a piece of paper. You're going to want to have your architectural scale, either a rolling ruler like this. This kind of acts as our primitive drafting board, if you will. Either you can use that or something along the lines of a builder's square. That can work as well. You're going to want a triangle that is a 45 degree. Some kind of pencil, writing utensil, a compass, as well at the very end you'll probably want a fine-lined pen of sorts. I've got just a Sharpie fine point, as well as a sign pen for some thicker line types. So that's it. Before we get started, however, this is the drawing that we are going to create, the Doric block order. And as you first observe with the block order, there's a couple of things that you should be aware of. One is that we are going to draw this in a simplified fashion, okay? The normal Doric order, when you get into more detail in a later video, we will go ahead and draw the actual, all the molding profiles for the Doric column itself with its capital and base, etc. But the simplified version is helpful, especially when you're going through preliminary design exercises and things along those lines, to enable you to get the overall proportions as you're applying them to a design problem. So, with the Doric order, there's a couple things you should know. First off, the column height is 8D, 8 diameters. So here's our diameter of our column if it was circular. It would be 8 of those tall. Okay, so here on the side I've got these graphic scales that indicate that. The other thing to note is that this relationship of 8 to the beam, the entablature, is 2 diameters in height. Each of these classical elements is usually broken down into 3 parts. So the column itself is subdivided. It has a base, a shaft, and a capital. The entablature is broken down into 3. It's got its architrave, frieze, and cornice. So that's important to understand. The other thing, if you look at this, we've also got this bottom piece, and sometimes we include this and sometimes we don't, but this is called the pedestal itself. In some instances, it is the same size as the entablature. It depends on your project, but also which classical treatise you're following. So this pedestal is also, for the Doric order, 2 diameters tall. We're just going to use that same proportion there. And the pedestal, just as with the column and the entablature, is subdivided into 3 parts: the base, the die, and the cap. All right, so let's get started. So with that, we are going to need to create a baseline for our drawing. And the important thing to understand is this: we're going to draw this drawing to scale, and we are going to use, as for D, if this was built in real life, we're imagining that D here, the diameter of the column is actually 1 foot or 12 inches in diameter. So because of that, we're creating a scale drawing. So to create a scale drawing, we are going to assume that D there is the size of 3/4 of an inch. So 3/4 of an inch is going to equal 1 foot. And that is going to be the basis for our design. So I've written this down here in the corner. And that's going to give us a general baseline as we create all of these elements and parts. There's other ways to create it without using a scale, but you would need to subdivide and do a lot of that. But for time's sakes, to help us be efficient, we're going to just draw this to a particular scale. All right, so with that, you can see here on the side, our overall height for the entire Doric block order is 9 inches. So to get me started, I'm going to go ahead and use this builder's square to get me a good baseline. And I'm going to switch over to my pencil. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and create a vertical line here. I'm going to mark that top at 9 inches and mark the bottom. And while I've got that there, I am also going to create a horizontal line across as my base for the entire block order. So the first thing I need to do is I'm going to divide this 9 inches as you can see here. I'm going to create a graphic scale on the side. This is going to give me my hierarchy. It's going to set up the datum point for my pedestal height. It's going to give me this line across for my total column height, as well as the height of my entablature. So we need to divide this into 6 parts. So if we took 9 inches divided by 6, that will give us 1.5 inches. So before I start dividing that, however, I am going to use my rolling ruler to create another parallel line to that first vertical line that we just created, and that's going to help me set that up. So I'm going to go ahead and use now my ruler, my builder's square, to add a tick mark to every 1.5 inches. I'm going to put one at 1.5, 3, 4.5, 6, 7.5, and we've got it at 9 there at the top. Alright, so the nice thing is that now I can go ahead and use my builder square that I've got those that part outlined for me, and I'm going to add a top line here that goes across. We know that that next phase, that next tick mark down, that is going to reveal our entablature height. So I'm going to use this square, and actually I'll just use my rolling ruler. Demonstrate a couple of different methods that you can go through when you're creating this. And then I'm going to go all the way down, almost to the bottom, to the last one right above there, and that's going to be my pedestal. And let's just make sure we got those correct. Should be 1.5 inches, both of those, and we're good. Okay. So the next thing, beyond setting up this overall 6 divisions for the 9 inches, what we're going to do now is we're going to subdivide the column itself. So we're going to use D, the diameter, to understand, okay, how tall should the column be? Because once we create that graphic scale, we can use that to then subdivide to get the height of the base, the height of the column capital, etc. So let's go ahead and create that secondary graphic scale there on the side. So I'm going to use my rolling ruler here. Go over just a little ways. Draft that up. And this, the parallel lines that I'm creating here, if you were to measure them, they're more or less a 1/16 of an inch apart. So if that gives you a helpful guideline there. Okay, so if I'm now going to subdivide this into 8, there's a couple of methods that you could do this. Since we are drawing this to scale, that gives us a baseline. But if you were not, how would you do that? So first off, you're going to take your normal ruler, so at an inch scale, and I would put the 0 here, and I would move it so that your diagonal lines up with 8 inches. So if you can see there, so if I was to create a diagonal here, and this is not necessarily the way we're going to do it, but if that would allow me to divide this vertical dimension into 8 equal parts. So if I was to put a tick mark at each of these inches, and then take those across, that would essentially give me those 8 divisions. And so that's a helpful rule in general when you're dealing with proportions and you don't necessarily have something that's an ideal dimension, and you want to quickly subdivide the surface or that line. Okay, so, but with these 8 divisions, I know because I've already done the math and used my architectural scale, but they are essentially 3/4 of an inch. So if you were to use your architectural scale and go to the one that is the 3/4 of an inch, we can then subdivide that into 8. So if I was to go ahead and place my 3/4 of an inch scale here, you can see there it's nicely got the 8 divisions, but this is the scale that we're actually drawing everything at. And you'll notice a couple of these are lining up with those 1.5" divisions that we created earlier. Okay, so now we've got our column height, which is 8D. And so I'm going to go ahead and just write here to the side, this is 8D, 8 diameters in height. My overall entablature is 2 diameters in height as well, and then my base is 2 diameters, the pedestal. Okay, now that we've got that, we're going to go ahead and the entablature itself for the Doric order is usually subdivided into, that 2D is subdivided into 8. So if we were to divide this, we could do the diagonal rule here, just as we've done earlier. Or what we can do is, if we mathematically divided 1.5" divided by 8, we could do the math, and it comes up with 3/16 of an inch. So if I've got my architectural scale, that can help me right away subdivide that. So if I place my 3/16 of an inch, you can see there I've already got the 8 divisions. So if I go ahead and add those in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, and 8. So I've got my 8 subdivisions. So I'm just going to write an 8 there so I can remember. And now on the bottom, to help me break down the pedestal itself, I'm also going to subdivide that 2D into 8 divisions. So I'm going to keep using my 3/16 of an inch. All right. So the nice thing is that once I have done that, that can help me create some additional horizontal lines to set up some of the breaks within my entablature, as well as some of those breaks for my pedestal itself as well. So if I grab my rolling ruler again, I'm going to start from the bottom of the entablature, this line here. I'm going to go vertical. I'm going to go up 2 divisions, 2 of those 8 that we just created, and I'm going to strike a line across. Then for the next portion is the frieze. I'm going to go up another, 3 subdivisions. And so what this will equate to, I'll label this in just a minute, but the architrave is essentially half D, or half the diameter. The frieze is 3/4 the diameter, and the cornice is 3/4 the diameter as well. All right, so let's go ahead and do the pedestal as well. For the pedestal, I'm going to start at the top. And I'm going to do this reverse. I'm going to go down 1 division here. And then for the bottom one, I'm going to go down another 5 divisions that you can see here on the side. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Actually, I'm going to go up from the bottom just to make sure I am being parallel. Okay, there we go. All right, now that I've got those divisions, now it's time to go ahead and let's place the center line of our column. Okay, so I am going to choose a location for this. If I was to, give you a measurement specifically, let's go ahead here. I'd say more or less we're trying to create this center line in kind of the middle of your page if you're working on an 8.5 by 11. So because this is the center line, I am going to do kind of a, just instead of just a solid line, I'm going to do a dash dot line type. Okay. I check myself, make sure I am being square here. Because if you can get off just a little bit, things will throw your drawing off. Okay, so I know that my diameter of the column is 3/4 of an inch, as we talked about earlier. So if I take my architectural scale and go to 3/4 of an inch, on that you'll notice that there is a tick mark, whether I'm doing it on the 1 and the 0, or using the other side where I've got all of the inch tick marks on there. But what I'm going to do first is I'm going to go ahead and mark that both sides so that 3/4 of an inch is centered on that line that we just created, that center line. That's important because that marks where D is located, that measurement. I'm going to go ahead and mark it down below within the pedestal, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to place a little graphic scale there that indicates what D is. Now the first thing you're going to note is that there is another graphic scale here on the bottom, which is 8/6 D. So if we had D and we divided it by 6, and then we added 1 to either side, that would give us the 8/6 D. This dimension is important to subdivide D into 6, because at the top of the column tapers. Once it gets past a third of the way up, it starts to taper. We call this entasis. It's kind of a bulging of the column, and then as it tapers up. And so at the top of the column there, we've got 5/6 diameter. And then as we get to the column capital itself, it enlarges to 7/6 D. Okay, so subdividing that D into 6 is helpful in general, and so you can see why. So let's go ahead and do that. All right, so let's create our D first. It's not being very nice to me. Okay. All right. Alright, so we'll create a small graphic scale right down here. We will keep going down. We're going to create another one. So we'll have one as the baseline for D, and then another one there for our 860. Okay. So if we were to divide D into 6, what it equates to is every one of those 6 is the equivalent of 1/8 of an inch. And so if I take my architectural scale to 1/8 of an inch, and first I'm going to place it so that I've got the 0 on this side, 3 is right on that center line, and then 6 would be aligned with the other edge of D. So I'm going to go ahead and put a tick mark for every one of those. And to make it 8, I'm going to go ahead and put another line on the side, as well as on the right, as well as the left. And that is going to give me that 8/6D. So I'm going to write 8/6D there, and that this one is D. Okay. So now that we've got that, we can go ahead and start constructing the sides of our pedestal. And you can see here, because that gives us that. It is also going to give us the outboard portion of the base molding there at the for the column itself. So we're going to use that. So I'm going to go ahead and use my rolling ruler here to be able to create a parallel line. Create a vertical one here, in this section, and another one right here. Once I get above the pedestal, I'm going to go vertical with it just a little ways. Same with the other side. All right. Okay, so now that we've got that, we can start going vertical with some of these lines. So in particular, we can start with the column shaft itself. I'm going to take this back over. We're going to go up to the edge of D. We're going to go up about 1/3 of the way on that. Same as this other side. So this is the one spot where I will actually use my compass. I'll place it here at this center line, and I'm going to adjust the compass so that half of D is the radius of the compass. So I'm going to place my pointy part of my compass there and make sure I can create this circle. So if we were cutting the column in half, that would reveal its full diameter as D. Okay, doing good. So next, what we're going to do is we are going to set up a couple of the heights of the actual column base, as well as the height for the column capital. Something's looking a little off there on my bottom. Let me just double check. That's not right. And that's what I mean about getting slightly off on some of these. So you can see that that 1.5 inches for the bottom, throwing things off just a little bit. Okay. So I'm going to use my square here to allow this to help me to be a little bit more accurate. Okay. Do this course correction now, otherwise things are gonna get a little wonky as we keep going. All right. That should help things a lot better. Okay, so with that, we are going to subdivide D into 2. So if we took 3/4 of an inch, we divide it in half, right? We've got 6/8 of an inch, or excuse me, 3/8 of an inch. So if I take my 3/8 of an inch here on the side scale, I can quickly find that subdivision there. And I'm going to also do that on the top, right before the entablature. Alright, so we're going to create another graphic scale. We're going to create it for that division of 2 for D, but we're also going to create a small one down below. We're going to need that eventually for the pedestal. We're going to also need to subdivide the cornice, those 3 divisions that we created up at the top, into another 4. So we're going to do that at this point. So if I go ahead and create another parallel line here, I'm going to do it just at the top, do it right here at the bottom for the base of the pedestal. I'm going to do one here at the top for the column capital, and then here at the top for the cornice. I'll move that away about 1/8 of an inch. Create another vertical there for the capital, the column base, as well as part of the base for the pedestal. Carry those lines across. We've got our divisions now for half D. I'm just going to put D over 2, so we understand that that is half D. Okay. And we'll come back and subdivide these in just a moment. Alright, so now what we are going to do is we're going to create a horizontal line at that half D mark. Goes across there. That is going to give us the height of our base. Let me go just a little bit further so I can label that later on. Okay, then at the top here, I'm going to go down to that mark, across, That is going to give me my column capital height. Okay. So with that, now, what we're going to do is we are going to find up here at the top, we are going to find that 5/6D for the narrow portion of the column shaft itself, as well as the 7/6D, the overall for the column capital. So to do that, remember, to get our D, and divide that into 6, we are going to our 1/8 inch scale. So right underneath the capital itself, right here, we're going to go ahead and subdivide that into 5. So to do that, I am essentially going into 2.5 on my scale here. So I'll have 2.5 on this side. And I will have another 2.5 on the other side to equate to our 5/6D that we talked about earlier. Okay, so right above that though, I need to create 7D. So to do that, I'm going to, just as I did down here, I'm going to go to, instead of 2.5, I'm going to go to 3.5. On one side, and this time I'm actually going to create a little tick mark for each of these, so I can get to 7. And what we'll do is we will create a small little graphic scale here. Indicate that that is indeed our 7/6D. And then we will also call this 5/6D right there. I'm going to use a little smaller square here, or you could use your triangle, but I am going to create the sides of the column capital. We have those proportions. Great. So the next thing that we need to do here is we need to subdivide this column into 3 portions. And what we're going to do that, because we're drawing this to scale, we've got a nice number because the overall column height is 6 inches. So we're going to create a small graphic scale with 3 divisions there, with a tick mark at every 2 inches. So if I grab my rolling ruler here, create a parallel line, okay, grab my scale, every 2 inches up, I'm going to place a tick mark, and that is going to be my 3 divisions. Okay. That first one, though, I'm going to use that, and that is going to be my baseline for when the entasis on my column begins. So create a little line across there. I might need to erase a little that straight portion of the column. May have gone up beyond that. You know, this is not necessarily just a diagonal shot. For ease of our purposes, it actually has a bulge on it, but we are just going to connect the dots here for ours, so it tapers in. There's a more accurate way to convey this. So there we go. We've got our entasis. And so we've got our division of 3. We're going to label this as the entasis portion of the column. Okay. So with that, now the question is, okay, what about the entablature up here? What about some of this other stuff on the pedestal? So the nice thing is that this 5-6D here, if we were to carry that line up right here, that is going to be the face of our entablature. All right, so if I grab my ruler here, and it is going to be straight for the architrave as well as the frieze. So we're going to create a vertical line at the top of the column going up, and we're going to stop at the bottom of the cornice. And this is where we're going to need our 45-degree triangle here, because what we're going to do is we are going to create a 45-degree diagonal line from that bottom part of the cornice over to the top, and that is going to create a couple of just a guiding point for us. But we could also actually, that vertical line that we created, we can add a dash going up there until it gets to the top of the entablature, because if we were to measure that 1D over, or 3/4 of an inch, that's going to give us the edge extension of the full on cornice. So we're going to go ahead and just make a little line there and use our scale, find 3/4 of an inch, mark that. Because what that is going to create for us is 1D. And that is the extent of the cornice. And we'll get to that detail in just a minute. So now that we've got a lot of these lines on here, we're going to go ahead and label some of this stuff. This is the architrave. Right above that is the frieze. And above that we have the cornice. So like we were saying before, this distance for the cornice is 3/4 D. The frieze is another 3/4 D. And the architrave is 1/2 D. Right below that we have the column capital. That is also 1/2 D. Down here we've got the base, column base, and that is 1/2 D. Below that we've got the cap. That's the top part of the pedestal. We've got what is called the die, and then we've got a base for the pedestal as well. Okay. So I'm going to use our rolling ruler. We're going to create a kind of like a dimension stringer over on the side. I'm going to use this line over here to get a baseline to go off of. Okay. So with that, I'm going to mark off a couple of key elements. First off, I'm going to erase some of these other lines that extend beyond. I don't need those. So what I want to illustrate is, first off, the pedestal. Which is 2D height. I'm going to erase that line for the base, and this is the full column. Call this the Doric column. And that is 8D in height. We'll erase this line here, and we'll put a tick mark. So that extent is the pedestal. This extent is the column. And up above this, we'll add the entablature. Oops, I can actually leave that one. So the entablature that is 2D in height, similar to the pedestal. Okay. So with that, we're going to go ahead and jump into some of the other details here. Now that we've got a lot of this marked out, I'm going to go ahead and add some of these other numbers that I may have forgotten. So an 8 there on the bottom. So what we're going to do is, one of these 8s, we're going to subdivide that into 4 pieces so that we can get the part of the column, the pedestal base. And then we're going to start subdividing up here at the top for the cornice so we can get some of these other lines to get that information as well. All right, so to do that, I'm going to get my scale here, and just going to carry a line across for that. So if you remember, each of these 8 divisions was equivalent to 3/16 of an inch, and so we're going to get our 3/16 of an inch scale here. And if we put the one with a lot of little tick marks on there, that one in particular is divided into 12, but there are 4 main marks there. And we can use those to then subdivide it into 4. So I'm going to draw number 4 there to remind myself. And if I go up one of those divisions and take a line across, that is going to give me the top of the base. So, I'm going to get my rolling ruler here to create a parallel line. So from that first division over, I'm going to go up just until I can get that portion of the base. Now what I'm going to do is I am going to use my 45-degree triangle, and this 8,6D here at the top, that vertical line we created for the side, I'm going to create a 45 down from that. That is going to be the extent of the base for the pedestal. I'm going to do that same on the other side. All right. And then for this cap portion, what we're going to do is we're going to upturn that 45 degrees, as you can see here. So still using my triangle. One side, and we will flip it around to do the opposite side. Okay, just like that. All right, so that gives us the extent of bottom third of our column. Just make some of those a little thicker line weights so that you can see that extent. All right. Actually, I'll just make this a dashed line down from the column so you can see that it connects to D. All right. So if we start getting up here at the top, let's make those subdivisions, those horizontal subdivisions for the cornice itself. So to do that, what we're going to do is we are going to get our architectural scale, and to subdivide these 3 8 divisions that we created earlier that were 3/16 of an inch. You could do the math and subdivide them into 4, right? But I've gone ahead and done the math for you, and we are at 1/8 of an inch. So if you grab your 1/8 of an inch scale here, wait, did I do that right? Let me just double check here. Excuse me. No, I did not do that right. Oh, that's right. There's 4. Okay. Something was throwing me off there for a second. Let's see here. 3/16 of an inch. Just double check this. Okay. All right. What is this? It's actually not quite a perfect 1/8 of an inch. And so what we're going to do, we're going to subdivide this the old-fashioned way. All right, so let's use our diagonal method. So let's find a number that would be helpful. Let's just use our inch scale. So for our inch, I would like you to put at the top of the frieze, in between, at the bottom of the cornice, and at the top of the cornice, make a diagonal line, a light diagonal line that indicates exactly 1 inch. And so on your inch, you can subdivide that into 4. And now that we have those subdivisions, we can actually take our rolling ruler here. We will drag horizontal line across. Each of those, so that I get those 4 subdivisions that we're looking for. Okay. Great. So from there, what we're going to do, and let me just double check this guy. This guy looks a little wonky. Yeah, slightly off. All right. So if we go vertical for the architrave, the frieze, and then we stop there at the top of the frieze, we go diagonal 45 degrees, and then we're going to go horizontal a distance, and that horizontal distance is going to be 3/4 D. So as you may recall, 3/4 D is the same equivalent as the overall height of the frieze itself. So if we are using our 3/16 of an inch scale here, we are going to go over 3 feet. Right here. So 1, 2, and 3. And we're going to go vertical from there. So we're going to come on over horizontally, go vertical, and that distance there is 3/4 D. I'm going to take a dashed line vertically up, and what that should actually line up with is that diagonal that we created just a minute ago. Okay, so with that, we know where our 1D is. We're going to use our 45 degree to create the edge of cornice. So it hits that 1D. And it's not quite aligned with that others, and so from there we're going to do another vertical line down and jog that. And that gives us the extent of that cornice detail. Okay, so we've covered about everything at this point. The one thing that is unique about the Doric order itself is that we have these elements that are centered above each of the columns. These are called triglyphs. When we get into more detail, you'll see that it actually has 3 elements. And then in between those, we have a proportion of an exact square. Then we have another triglyph, another square, triglyph, square, triglyph. That square portion is called a metope. Sometimes there'll be ornament, decorative elements in there as well. But this is important with the Doric order because you use these triglyphs and metopes to do the actual spacing of your columns. So for instance, if I was to have another column centered right here, it would essentially be 2 spaces over, and that's how you use that module to design. So a triglyph itself, in this instance, it is 3/8 of an inch. I'm going to get my 3/8 scale. I'm going to place that there. Add 2 little tick marks so I can create the sides of the triglyph. Right next to that is actually 9/16. So if I get just my inch scale, so 8 is half of that, go over just 1. That will be my 9/16. I'm going to go back, add another 3/8. And when I add this 3/8, I'm going to add the center line there. So I've got that for reference. Go back to my 16th scale. Add a 9/16 mark. And the other way to do this as well is if you were to take the top of the capital from the architrave and the bottom of the architrave and do a diagonal line, that actually gives you the center line of the second triglyph. So I'll just demonstrate that here. So if I was to take a diagonal from the center line of the column, in between the column capital and the architrave, take that over and take a vertical line down, you'll see that is what gives you that center line of the triglyph. So I'm going to go ahead and get my rolling ruler here so I can strike a couple vertical lines quickly. I put those tick mark measurements. Okay. So the nice thing, if I was to, so this kind of illustrates the point. There. If I was also to grab my ruler and create another diagonal from the center line and that center of that, excuse me, not that, on the side of that first triglyph, you'll see that that is a perfect square in there. So I'll go ahead and do that for this other one as well, just to help illustrate that. And since I've got a little bit more space, I'll go ahead and add another triglyph here. Alright, so we've got 3/8 of an inch. And another 9/16. Okay. So let me just double check here. We've got most of our dimensions, everything labeled. Oh, I think the one thing we forgot here is to call out the shaft. And that is 7 diameters tall. Okay, we've got our 5/6D, 7/6, our half D for the height of our capital, architrave, frieze, cornice. And we could go ahead and just label that. That was our center line. Great. So I think that covers everything. The only thing that I would probably do is actually take my Sharpie after this point and outline a couple of the main profiles here so that I can have those pop up off the page in a little more detail. But that's it. Thanks for joining us.